The rain fell like needles that November night in 1932, cold and unforgiving, drumming against the tin roof of the small house on the edge of town. Inside, Thomas Harwell sat at a wooden table, worn smooth by years of use, staring at a piece of paper he could barely read in the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. His hands trembled, not from the cold that seeped through the cracks in the walls, but from something far deeper. Hunger had a way of making a man's hands shake, of making his vision blur at the edges, of turning his thoughts into a fog that was hard to navigate. Across from him, his wife Eleanor sat silent, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes fixed on nothing. She had stopped speaking 3 days ago, not from anger or stubbornness, but from a kind of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Her 2 children, Margaret and James, lay on a thin mattress in the corner of the room, their breathing shallow and irregular. Margaret was 8 years old. James was 5. Neither of them had eaten a proper meal in 2 weeks. Thomas looked down at the paper again. It was a notice from the Consolidated Trust Bank of Bradford, printed in cold, impersonal typeface. The words blurred together, but he knew what they meant. He had read them 100 times. Foreclosure? Default. Immediate seizure of assets. The farm was gone. The livestock had been sold months ago. The savings account, the one his father had opened for him when he was a boy, had been frozen and then emptied by something called administrative fees and penalty interest. He did not fully understand how it had happened, only that it had, and that there was no appeal, no mercy, no way out. He had worked that land for 20 years. He had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Harwells had broken their backs on that soil, had planted and harvested and prayed and hoped, and now it was gone, taken by men in suits who had never set foot on the property, who had never felt the weight of a plow or the sting of winter wind on their faces, taken by numbers on a ledger, by signatures on contracts Thomas had signed in good faith, believing that the bank would honor its word, that the system would protect him if he worked hard and played by the rules. But the system had not protected him. The system had crushed him. The Great Depression had swept through the country like a plague, and the banks, those towering institutions that had promised security and stability, had become predators. They called in loans that farmers could not repay. They foreclosed on properties with ruthless efficiency. They seized assets and sold them for fractions of their worth, pocketing the difference and calling it business. And when men like Thomas Harwell stood in their offices, hat in hand, begging for an extension or a reduction or just a little more time, the bankers looked at them with cold, indifferent eyes and said, no. Thomas had gone to the bank 6 times in the past year. 6 times he had walked through the heavy oak doors of the Consolidated Trust Bank, past the marble columns and polished brass fixtures, into the office of Mr. Clarence Whitmore, the branch manager. 6 times he had explained his situation, had shown his records, had promised to pay every cent he owed if they would just give him time. And 6 times, Mr. Whitmore had sat behind his enormous mahogany desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and had delivered the same verdict with the same flat, emotionless tone. The bank could not make exceptions. The contract was clear. The debt was due. On the 6th visit, Thomas had done something he was not proud of. He had begged. He had actually gotten down on his knees in that polished office in front of that man in his expensive suit, and he had begged for the lives of his children. He had told Mr. Whitmore that his daughter had stopped growing, that his son cried himself to sleep every night from the pain in his empty stomach, that his wife had begun to look at him with eyes full of quiet, terrible resignation. Mr. Whitmore had looked down at him with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. It was hard to tell. And then he had said, very softly, that business was business, and that Thomas should leave before he made a scene. Thomas had left. He had walked out of that bank with his dignity in shreds, had walked through the streets of Bradford with his head down, feeling the eyes of the town on him, knowing that everyone knew, that his failure was public and complete. He had walked the 5 miles back to his house in the rain, and when he had arrived, he had found Eleanor sitting exactly where she sat now, staring at nothing, and the children lying exactly where they lay now, too weak to play, too hungry to cry. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, sitting in the cold and the dark, Thomas made a decision. It was not a decision born of hope or faith or any noble impulse. It was a decision born of pure crystalline despair. He folded the foreclosure notice carefully, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and stood up. Eleanor did not look at him. The children did not stir. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the rain. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he could not stay. Thomas walked through the night, through the rain that soaked him to the bone, through streets that grew emptier and darker as the hours passed. He walked past the shuttered storefronts and the soup kitchens with their lines of hollow-eyed men. He walked past the railroad tracks, where groups of drifters huddled under tarps, and past the warehouses where the smell of rotting produce hung thick in the air. He walked until his legs ached and his lungs burned, until the rain began to ease and the first gray light of dawn broke over the horizon. And then he found himself standing in front of the Consolidated Trust Bank. It was early morning, too early for the bank to be open. The street was empty. The windows were dark. Thomas stood there staring up at the building, at the marble facade and the brass nameplate and the heavy oak doors, and he felt something shift inside him. It was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was something colder, something harder, something that settled into his chest like a stone. He thought about his children lying on that thin mattress, their ribs showing through their skin. He thought about his wife, who had once been so full of life and laughter, now reduced to a silent ghost. He thought about his father and his grandfather, and all the years of work and hope and faith that had been poured into that land, into that life, only to be taken away by men who had never worked a day in their lives, who had never known what it meant to be truly desperate. And Thomas Harwell, standing in the gray dawn light in front of the bank that had destroyed him, made a promise to himself. He did not know how, and he did not know when, but someday, somehow, he would make them pay. Not with violence, not with rage, but with something far more devastating. He would make them understand what they had done. He would make them feel it. He turned and walked away, and he did not look back. The years that followed were years of survival. Thomas took his family and left Bradford, left the state, left everything they had known. They drifted west, following the rumors of work, of opportunity, of anything that might keep them alive. They picked fruit in California, worked in canneries in Oregon, lived in tent cities and Hoovervilles and anywhere else that would have them. Margaret and James grew up on the road, thin and hard and watchful, learning early that the world was not kind, that trust was a luxury they could not afford. Eleanor never fully recovered. The silence that had taken hold of her that November night never quite let go. She spoke when necessary, smiled when appropriate, but there was a distance in her eyes that Thomas could never bridge. He knew he had failed her, failed all of them, and that knowledge was a weight he carried every day. But Thomas survived. More than that, he learned. He learned how the system worked, how money moved, how banks operated, how men like Clarence Whitmore could destroy lives with the stroke of a pen and sleep soundly at night. He read every book he could find on finance, on economics, on the structure of the banking system. He worked odd jobs during the day and studied at night, hunched over borrowed textbooks in the dim light of whatever temporary shelter they were living in. He learned about fractional reserve banking, about how banks could lend out money they did not actually have. He learned about margin calls and liquidity crises, and the delicate web of trust and credit that held the entire system together. He learned that banks were not the indestructible fortresses they appeared to be. They were fragile. They were vulnerable. And if you knew where to press, if you understood the mechanics, you could make them collapse. It took 11 years. 11 years of grinding poverty and relentless study. 11 years of watching his children grow up without a home, without stability, without the childhood they deserved. 11 years of seeing the light in Eleanor's eyes grow dimmer and dimmer until she looked at him not with love or anger, but with a kind of weary acceptance. But in those 11 years, Thomas Harwell transformed himself. The desperate farmer who had begged on his knees became something else entirely. He became a man who understood the language of money, who could read a balance sheet like a map, who could see the vulnerabilities in a financial institution the way a doctor sees disease in a patient. He became, in his own quiet way, dangerous. By 1943, the Depression had ended. The war had changed everything. Factories were running at full capacity. Jobs were plentiful. The economy was booming. And banks, those banks that had foreclosed on millions of families, that had caused so much suffering and ruin, were thriving once again. The Consolidated Trust Bank of Bradford had expanded, had opened branches in 3 new cities, had doubled its assets. Mr. Clarence Whitmore had been promoted to regional director, overseeing operations across the entire state. Thomas read about it in a newspaper one afternoon, sitting in a diner in Sacramento. He read about the bank's success, about Mr. Whitmore's rise through the ranks, about the profits and the growth and the bright future ahead. And as he read, that cold, hard thing that had settled in his chest 11 years ago began to stir. He folded the newspaper carefully, paid for his coffee, and walked out into the sunlight. It took him 3 months to put the pieces in place. 3 months of careful planning, of quietly gathering information, of making connections and building credibility. He had saved money over the years, not much, but enough. He had learned to present himself well, to speak the language of businessmen, to blend in. He was no longer the desperate farmer in worn overalls. He was Thomas Harwell, independent financial consultant, a man who had made a modest fortune advising small businesses during the war boom, a man with references and credentials and a quiet, unassuming competence. He returned to Bradford in the spring of 1944, rented a small office downtown, and waited. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. The Consolidated Trust Bank, in its eagerness to capitalize on the post-war boom, had overextended itself. It had made a series of aggressive investments in commercial real estate, had issued loans to developers and speculators who promised big returns. On paper, everything looked fine. The balance sheets were healthy. The quarterly reports were glowing. But Thomas, studying the bank's public filings with the eye of a man who had spent 11 years learning to see the invisible, noticed something, a pattern, a vulnerability. The bank's liquidity was dangerously low. They had tied up too much capital in long-term investments, and their cash reserves were thin. Not critically thin, not yet, but thin enough that if something went wrong, if there was a sudden demand for withdrawals, if confidence began to waver, the whole structure could become unstable. All it would take was a little pressure in the right place. Thomas began his work quietly. He started by visiting the bank, not as a desperate farmer begging for mercy, but as a potential client. He met with junior managers, asked questions about investment opportunities, about interest rates, about the bank's stability and reputation. He was polite, professional, curious. He made small deposits, opened accounts, became a familiar face, and then, with surgical precision, he began to spread doubt. It started with casual conversations. A word here, a question there. He would mention, offhandedly to a shopkeeper or businessman, that he had heard rumors about the Consolidated Trust Bank's investments, that some of the properties they had backed were not performing as expected, that there might be issues with liquidity. He never made accusations. He never stated anything as fact. He simply asked questions, raised concerns, planted seeds. In a small town like Bradford, where everyone knew everyone, where gossip spread like wildfire, those seeds took root quickly. Within weeks, whispers began to circulate. People began to wonder, were their deposits safe? Was the bank as solid as it appeared? Maybe it would be wise to withdraw some cash, just to be careful, just in case. Nothing major, just enough to feel secure. The first wave of withdrawals was small, manageable. The bank had enough reserves to handle it. But then more people began to withdraw, and then more. The trickle became a stream, and the stream became a flood. Thomas watched it all from his small office, tracking the bank's public statements, its reassurances, its increasingly desperate attempts to project confidence. He watched as the lines outside the bank grew longer, as the panic began to set in, as the very thing the bank feared most, a loss of public trust, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, when the bank was at its most vulnerable, when its cash reserves were nearly depleted and its reputation was in tatters, Thomas made his move. He went to see Mr. Clarence Whitmore. The regional director's office was on the top floor of the main branch, a large corner suite with windows overlooking the town. Thomas was shown in by a nervous secretary who kept glancing at the phone as if expecting it to ring with more bad news. Mr. Whitmore sat behind his enormous desk, older now, grayer, but still carrying himself with that same air of superiority, though now it was tinged with something else, fear. He looked up as Thomas entered, and there was no recognition in his eyes. Why would there be? The man standing before him was not the desperate farmer who had begged on his knees 11 years ago. That man was gone. Mr. Harwell, Whitmore said, his voice tight. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. Thomas sat. He said nothing. He simply waited. Whitmore cleared his throat. I understand you're a financial consultant, that you've been successful in advising businesses during these uncertain times. I've had some success, Thomas said quietly. We're facing a situation, Whitmore continued, and Thomas could hear the strain in his voice. A temporary liquidity issue. Nothing fundamental, you understand. Just a crisis of confidence. We need someone with expertise, someone who can help us stabilize, who can advise us on the best course of action. We're prepared to pay very generously for your services. Thomas looked at the man across the desk, at the expensive suit and the polished shoes and the fear in his eyes, and he felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a cold, empty clarity. Tell me, Thomas said softly, do you remember a farmer who came to this office 11 years ago? A man who begged you for help, who told you his children were starving? Whitmore's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His name was Thomas Harwell, Thomas continued, his voice perfectly calm. You told him that business was business. You told him to leave before he made a scene. Do you remember? Whitmore's hands gripped the edge of his desk. I had no choice. The board, the regulations. I was following policy. Policy, Thomas repeated. Yes, policy. The same policy that foreclosed on hundreds of families. The same policy that destroyed lives while men like you collected your bonuses and your promotions. Business was business, wasn't it, Mr. Whitmore? What do you want? Whitmore whispered. Thomas stood. He looked around the office at the mahogany furniture and the crystal decanters and the framed certificates on the walls. He looked at the view of the town where he had once lived, where he had once believed that hard work and honesty would be enough. I don't want anything, Thomas said. I came here to give you a message. This bank is finished, not because of any external crisis, not because of the economy or the war or bad luck. It's finished because I made it so. Every doubt, every rumor, every question that led to this run on your bank, that started with me. I studied your vulnerabilities. I identified your weaknesses. And I pressed until you broke. Whitmore's face had gone from pale to ashen. You can't. I already did, Thomas said. And now you're going to live with it. You're going to lose everything. Your bank, your reputation, your career. You're going to know what it feels like to be powerless, to watch everything you built crumble, to realize that all your confidence and all your policy and all your business was built on nothing but air. You're going to learn what I learned 11 years ago, that the system doesn't care about you, that when you fall, no one will catch you. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. My daughter survived, Mr. Whitmore. Barely. She has scars from malnutrition that will never fully heal. My son lost 2 years of education because we were too poor to keep him in school. My wife never spoke another full sentence after that November night. She died last year, still silent, still broken, but we survived. I want you to know that. We survived what you did to us. And now you get to see what survival costs. Thomas walked out of the office, out of the bank, out into the spring sunlight. Behind him, he could hear Whitmore calling after him, but he did not turn around. He walked down the street, past the line of people still trying to withdraw their money, past the police officers trying to maintain order, past the reporters who were beginning to gather, sensing a story. He walked until he reached the edge of town, until he could see the land where his farm had once stood. It was different now, subdivided and sold off, covered with new houses and new lives. Nothing remained of what had been. But Thomas stood there anyway, looking out at the horizon, remembering. The Consolidated Trust Bank of Bradford collapsed within a week. The run on deposits became unstoppable. The bank's investments, those aggressive bets on commercial real estate, turned out to be even worse than Thomas had suspected. Developers defaulted. Properties were abandoned. The bank's assets evaporated. Federal regulators stepped in, but it was too late. The bank was liquidated. Its branches were sold off to competitors. Mr. Clarence Whitmore resigned in disgrace, his career and reputation in ruins. In the years that followed, investigators would try to determine what had caused the collapse. They would point to poor management, to risky investments, to the inherent instability of the post-war economy. Some would note the rumors that had circulated in the weeks before the collapse, the whispers of doubt that had sparked the initial wave of withdrawals, but they would never be able to trace those rumors to their source. They would remain a mystery, a footnote in the history of a failed institution. Thomas Harwell never told anyone what he had done. He moved away from Bradford, settled in a small town on the coast, and lived quietly for the rest of his life. He never remarried. He stayed close to his children, watched them grow and heal and build their own lives. Margaret became a teacher. James became a carpenter. They both had children of their own, and Thomas was a good grandfather, patient and kind and always present. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch and look out at the ocean, and he would think about that November night in 1932, about the rain and the cold and the sound of his children's shallow breathing. He would think about the man he had been and the man he had become. He would think about justice and revenge and the fine line between them. And he would wonder if what he had done was right. The question had no easy answer. The Consolidated Trust Bank had destroyed his family, had destroyed hundreds of families. It had operated with ruthless efficiency, had prioritized profit over people, had used the law and the system to crush those who could not fight back. In that sense, what Thomas had done was justice. He had used the same system, the same cold logic, the same ruthless efficiency, and he had turned it against his oppressors. He had made them feel the consequences of their actions. But consequences had rippled outward in ways he had not fully anticipated. When the bank collapsed, depositors lost money. Some lost their life savings. Employees lost their jobs. Innocent people, people who had nothing to do with what had been done to Thomas Harwell, suffered. They were collateral damage in a war they did not know was being fought. Thomas thought about this often. He thought about the junior tellers and the secretaries and the maintenance workers who had been laid off when the bank went under. He thought about the families who had lost money, who had to start over, who faced their own hardships because of what he had set in motion. And he felt the weight of it. But he also thought about Margaret and James, about the scars they carried, about the childhood that had been stolen from them. He thought about Eleanor, about her silence and her slow fading and her death. He thought about the thousands of other families who had been destroyed by banks like the Consolidated Trust, families who had never gotten the chance to fight back, who had simply been crushed and forgotten. And in the end, Thomas came to a conclusion that was neither satisfying nor comfortable, but was simply true. The world was not built for justice. It was built for power. And sometimes, the only way to restore balance was to take that power and use it, even if it meant becoming something you never wanted to be. Intelligent revenge was not about anger. It was not about lashing out or seeking satisfaction. It was about understanding the system so completely, so thoroughly, that you could use its own weight against it. It was about patience and precision, and the willingness to carry a wound for as long as it took to deliver a blow that mattered. Thomas Harwell had carried his wound for 11 years, and when the time came, he had struck with surgical precision. He had not raised his voice. He had not thrown a punch. He had simply identified a weakness, applied pressure, and watched as the entire structure collapsed. It was not the revenge of a hero. It was not noble or clean or morally simple. It was the revenge of a man who had lost everything, who had been ground down by a system that did not care whether he lived or died, and who had decided that if he was going to suffer, then those who had caused that suffering would understand what they had done. In the spring of 1960, Thomas Harwell died quietly in his sleep at the age of 63. His children were with him. They held his hands and told him they loved him and thanked him for everything he had done. He smiled, and in that moment he looked peaceful. They buried him in a small cemetery overlooking the ocean. There was no grand funeral, no speeches, no public mourning, just a simple service attended by family and a few friends. On his headstone, they carved only his name and the years of his life. Nothing more was needed. But Margaret, standing beside the grave as the sun set over the water, thought about her father's life, about the man he had been and the things he had endured and the quiet, terrible justice he had delivered. And she thought about the world he had left behind, a world where banks still foreclosed on families, where the powerful still crushed the powerless, where the system still ground people down without mercy. She thought about whether anything had really changed. And she realized that her father's story was not really about revenge at all. It was about something more fundamental. It was about the question of what a person does when the system fails them, when the rules do not protect them, when the institutions that promise security and justice reveal themselves to be hollow. It was about the moment when a person decides that they will no longer be a victim, that they will no longer accept their suffering as inevitable. Thomas Harwell had made that decision on a gray November morning in 1932, standing in the rain outside the bank that had destroyed his life. And for 11 years, he had worked toward a single goal: not to kill, not to steal, not to break the law, but simply to make the system understand that it was not invincible, that it could be beaten, that the people it crushed could fight back. Whether that made him a hero or a villain was a question Margaret could not answer. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps he was neither. Perhaps he was simply a man who had been pushed too far, who had found a way to push back, and who had lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. What she knew, standing there by his grave, was that her father had taught her something important. He had taught her that power was not fixed, that systems were not eternal, that the balance could shift if you were smart enough and patient enough and willing enough to do what needed to be done. He had taught her that sometimes the only way to survive was to become dangerous. The sun set, the mourners left. Margaret stood alone by the grave for a long time, thinking about her father and her mother and her brother and all the years of struggle and survival. She thought about the farm they had lost, about the house with the tin roof and the kerosene lamp, about the night when everything had fallen apart. And then she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas Harwell to rest in the quiet earth, his story told, his debt settled, his revenge complete. The system that had crushed him had learned for a brief moment what it meant to be crushed. Whether it had learned anything more than that, whether anything had truly changed, was a question for another time, another place, another generation. But on that evening, in that moment, there was only silence and the sound of the ocean and the memory of a man who had refused to be forgotten. Thomas Harwell had watched his family starve. 11 years later, the bank had begged for help. He had walked away and let it die. And in the cold mathematics of power and revenge, that was the only justice he would ever know.